In the summer of 1883, a young schoolteacher stepped off a westbound train in Caldwell, Kansas, carrying a leather satchel, a letter of appointment from the territorial board, and a set of expectations that the town was about to take apart, piece by piece. His name was Wayne Jennings. He was 24 years old, slight in build, with the kind of face that strangers tended to overlook at a first glance and remember clearly by the second. He had taught 1 year in a settled township in Ohio, where the schoolhouse had 4 walls, a working stove, and enough McGuffey readers to go around. He had arrived in Caldwell believing those were ordinary things, the baseline from which a person taught. He was wrong about that. He would learn how wrong before the first week was out. The schoolhouse stood at the north end of town on a rise above the main road, and Wayne walked to it the afternoon he arrived because he could see it from the depot and thought it would be a comfort to know the place before morning. It wasn't a comfort. The building had 3 standing walls and a partial 4th, and above those walls there was nothing. No roof. The timber frame was there, the collar ties still in place, but whatever boards had covered them had been stripped off the previous winter by a man who needed lumber more than the town needed a school that was not yet running. The floor was dirt, packed hard and fine as flour from 2 summers of wind. There were no benches, no stove, though a rusted flue collar was still bolted to the east wall where one had once been fitted. No books. A broken slate leaned against the wall nearest the door, cracked along the bottom third, and someone had written the word arithmetic in chalk on what remained of the good half, as if to mark what had been attempted there before the roof went. Wayne stood in the open frame with the late afternoon sun coming through where the ceiling should have been, and looked at what he had sent to make into a school before the first frost. In the Kansas summer of 1883, the first hard frost in that part of the territory came sometime in October, which gave him, by his count, a little fewer than 12 weeks. He went back to the boarding house and ate supper and sat with his satchel open across his knees and wrote a list in a pocket notebook: roof, stove, benches, books, chalk, and slates. He wrote it in that order because that was the order the cold would demand of him. The next morning he called on Nora Fitch, who served as select woman for the township, and whose name was on the letter that had accompanied his appointment. She was a compact, purposeful woman in her mid-40s with iron-gray hair and the manner of someone who had spent 20 years managing practical problems on a tight margin and did not intend to waste words on impractical ones. She received him in the front room of the township office, which occupied the ground floor of the mercantile, and she told him plainly what she thought he should do. "Write to the territorial board," she said. "Explain what you found. Ask for a delayed start and a proper appropriation. The board will send materials in the spring, and by April you will have a schoolhouse worth opening." Wayne listened to all of it. He asked how many children of school age were in the township. She said 31, maybe 34, if a family that had moved out to the creek came back before fall. He asked how many of those children had attended school the previous year. She looked at him steadily and said that there had been no previous year. The last teacher had left in the spring of 1882, and the roof had come down that winter. He thanked her, folded the pocket notebook into his coat, and told her he would have the school open before November. Nora Fitch studied him for a moment the way a person studies a letter that says something they do not quite believe. She did not argue further. She said she hoped he was right, in a tone that made clear she did not think he was. What neither of them knew yet, standing in that room on the morning of the 6th of July, was that the argument was already settled. Wayne had simply not yet had the chance to prove it. He spent the next 2 days walking the town, taking the measure of what was available and what was not. Caldwell in the summer of 1883 was not a prosperous place by any measure a person from Ohio would recognize. The cattle drives that had made the town briefly flush had been thinning out for several years as the railheads pushed further west, and what remained was a working settlement of dry goods dealers, a feed store, a smithy, a grain elevator going up slowly on the south end, and approximately 300 people living on varying margins of sufficiency. The nearest lumber yard was in a town 40 miles northeast, accessible by a freight wagon that ran twice a month when the road held. The feed store was owned by a man named Caleb Foss, who was friendly in the way of men who enjoy an audience, and who told Wayne across a counter piled with harness leather and salt blocks that he had a standing wager with the barber that the new teacher would write to the board inside a month and decamp by September. He said it without malice, with the comfortable amusement of a man who considered himself a reliable judge of situations and other people. Wayne bought a box of chalk from him and asked who did carpentry work in town. Foss leaned on the counter and said that Del Marsh did the rough work, the kind that did not need to be pretty, but that if he wanted something worth looking at, he ought to wait for the man who came through from the lumber town in August. Wayne asked where he could find Del Marsh. Foss told him, and then added that Del had a drinking problem and a temper, and had been in a dispute with two of the town's leading families over a fence line, and that most people preferred not to deal with him if they had other options. Wayne said he appreciated the information and left the chalk on the counter and walked to where Foss had directed him. Del Marsh lived in a low-roofed house at the far end of the side street, with a woodworking shed attached at the back that was significantly better constructed than the house itself. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with large, careful hands, and the particular kind of quietness that belongs to men who have been talked about unfavorably in public and have made a private decision to stop caring what is said. He was planing a board when Wayne arrived, and did not stop when Wayne introduced himself. Wayne told him what the schoolhouse needed. He told him the roof span, the wall height, the size of the frame as he had measured it. He said he could get lumber on the next freight run if he could arrange credit at the yard, and that he needed a carpenter who could work in the heat and who would not charge more than he could pay from the territorial stipend. Del kept planning. He asked what the stipend was. Wayne told him. Del said that was not much. Wayne said it was what there was. Del set the plane down and looked at him. He said he had heard about the schoolhouse and had figured it would sit empty until the board got around to it. Wayne said the board was not going to get around to it before the children of Caldwell needed a place to sit and learn arithmetic. Something in Del's expression shifted, a small tightening at the corners that was not quite a smile. He said he would come look at the frame in the morning. He came. He walked the structure twice, examined each collar tie, pressed his thumb into the base logs to test for rot, and stood for a long time looking at the east wall where the stove flue collar was bolted. He told Wayne the frame was sound. He told Wayne what lumber he would need, gave him the measurements in board feet with the economy of a man who had been calculating timber in his head for 30 years, and said that if Wayne could get the load from the yard in the next 2 weeks, they could have the roof closed before August was out. Wayne wrote the letter to the lumber yard that evening and enclosed a promissory note against the territorial stipend for $38. He also wrote 4 other letters that evening, one to the county school board requesting a donation of readers and primers, one to a church charitable society in Topeka that he had heard supplied frontier schools, one to his former headmaster in Ohio, asking for any spare volumes the school district could spare, and one to the territorial librarian in Topeka, asking about the process for obtaining a traveling book box. He sent all 5 letters on the morning freight. He did not tell Nora Fitch he had sent them. He did not tell anyone. Planning done quietly was still planning. and the town would see the results when the results arrived. This is a fair moment to tell you a little more about where Wayne Jennings had come from, and why a 24-year-old with 1 year of teaching behind him had arrived in a broken-down schoolhouse in a drying-out cattle town and chosen not to leave. He had grown up in a river valley in Ohio, the second of 4 children of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever when Wayne was 9, leaving the family to manage on what his mother could earn, taking in sewing on what the older children could contribute. Wayne had been the kind of child who did not talk much, but who read everything he could reach, and who had a particular gift for explaining things to other children in language they could follow. His first-grade teacher had noticed it. His fourth-grade teacher had confirmed it. By the time he finished his schooling, the path was already clear in the way paths are clear when a person has a talent that matches a need and a reason to use it. He had taken the Caldwell appointment because the pay was slightly better than what he was earning in Ohio, and because he had a practical understanding that a teacher who could manage a difficult post was a teacher who could write his own terms later. He was not naive about what he was walking into. The letter from the territorial board had noted that the schoolhouse was in need of some repair, which he had understood to be the kind of language that covered a wide range of actual conditions. He had simply not accounted for a missing roof. The lumber arrived on the second freight of July, 22 days after Wayne had sent the letter, on a wagon driven by a taciturn man who helped them unload and left again before sundown. Dell had already been at the schoolhouse for 4 days by then, repairing the partial fourth wall and fitting new floor joists over the packed dirt in preparation for puncheon boards. He had also found and repaired the old iron stove from the township storage shed, a piece of work that Nora Fitch later said had not been possible when she had tried to arrange it the previous autumn, though she allowed that she had not known Dell was the man to ask. They worked through July with the sun heavy and direct, Wayne learning by watching and doing what Dell showed him, splitting and fitting the puncheon floorboards, while Dell cut and notched rafters. There was a natural economy to working alongside Dell. He did not explain himself at length. He demonstrated, then moved to the next thing, and if Wayne asked a question, he answered it exactly and without elaboration, which Wayne found useful. Most of the townspeople who walked past on the road either did not stop or stopped only briefly, and their expressions when they noticed Dell working there carried a mixture of surprise and reservation that Wayne noticed and did not comment on. Ruth Denby was not most people. She was 12 years old, the eldest daughter of a widow who ran the boarding house where Wayne lived, and she had the particular watchfulness of a child who has had to pay attention to practical matters since she was small. She appeared at the schoolhouse the third day Wayne and Dell were working together, carrying a pail of water with a tin cup hanging off the handle, and she set it in the shade of the partial east wall without saying much and walked back toward town. She came back the following day with the pail, and the day after that, and by the end of the first week it was simply understood that she would come in the mid-morning and again in the late afternoon, and Wayne had started saving small tasks for her, asking her to hold boards steady while he marked them, or to count the remaining nails in a tin box so he could calculate whether he needed to get more from Foss. Ruth did not ask many questions about what they were building. She watched instead, and what she watched most carefully was Dell, with the focused appraisal of a child deciding whether a thing the adults have dismissed is worth dismissing. By the second week, she had stopped hanging back near the door and was handing Dell tools when he needed them without being asked, having figured out the sequence of what he was doing before he reached for the next thing. The first box of books arrived on the 12th of August. It came on the same freight wagon as a barrel of nails and 3 lengths of stovepipe, and Wayne carried it to the schoolhouse himself and set it on the new puncheon floor and opened it with a pry bar. Inside were 22 volumes, 9 McGuffey readers at varying grades, 4 arithmetic primers, 2 geography texts, a dictionary, a grammar, 4 volumes of history, and 1 copy of A Natural History of North America with color plates that Ruth, standing at Wayne's shoulder, went entirely quiet over for the better part of a minute. He wrote to thank the Charitable Society in Topeka and asked if there was a second box available. Caleb Foss was in the Mercantile when Wayne came to mail the reply letter, and he watched Wayne pay the postage with the expression of a man recalculating a wager he had made too confidently. He did not say anything directly to Wayne, but he mentioned to the barber that afternoon that the teacher seemed determined. The second week of August was when the trouble announced itself. Dell came to the schoolhouse one morning and stood under the newly framed roof, looking up at it, and told Wayne they were short on ridge boards. Not by much, he said. 3 boards of the right dimension, maybe 4. But the freight wagon was not scheduled back to the lumber yard for another 3 weeks, and the ridge was where the cold came in. Wayne asked what else was available. Dell thought about it for 2 days, which was his habit when a problem had more than one possible solution. On the 3rd day, he told Wayne that there was sound timber in the old grain shed at the edge of town, the one that the previous owner had abandoned when he had sold his operation and left in the spring of 1882. The shed was not being used. The boards were the right dimension. If Wayne could get permission to salvage them, they could mill them down and have what they needed before the end of the week. Wayne went to Nora Fitch and asked about the abandoned shed. She said the title was still in dispute between 2 families and that she could not give him permission to take anything from it. He asked if there was anyone who could resolve the title question in the near term. She said there was a circuit land officer who came through every 6 weeks, and the next visit was expected in September. Wayne did his arithmetic. September was too late if the first frost came early, as it sometimes did in that part of the territory. He thanked Nora and walked back to the schoolhouse and sat on one of the new benches that Dell had hewn from cottonwood and thought about the problem until a solution arrived that was simpler than he had been making it. He went back to the Mercantile and found Foss and asked if the feed store had any 12-foot boards of the relevant dimension in stock or in the back storeroom, and whether they could be sold on credit against the territorial stipend. Foss said he had 4 boards in the back that had been sitting for 2 years, and that he supposed he could let them go for cost. Wayne said that was fair. Foss asked him how close they were to done. Wayne told him. He told him the ridge was the last major piece, and that Dell expected a week of finish work after that. Foss was quiet for a moment, then nodded. He said he would bring the boards over himself the next morning. He did not mention the wager with the barber. He did not need to. The second box of books arrived on the 21st of August, 17 volumes this time, sent by the Charitable Society, along with a note from the territorial librarian saying that a traveling book box of 40 volumes had been designated for Caldwell and would arrive in October. Wayne read the librarian's note twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his coat. He had written the letter in July without knowing whether anything would come of it. This was what planning done quietly looked like when it arrived. He pinned a notice on the door of the Mercantile and the wall of the feed store, announcing that the Caldwell School would open on the first Monday of September for children between the ages of 6 and 15, and that readers and arithmetic primers would be provided. Nora Fitch read the notice. She stood in front of the Mercantile for a long moment, then walked up to the schoolhouse to look for herself. Dell was on the roof, fitting the last of the ridge boards. Wayne was below, marking slates on the floor. Ruth was stacking the books in the wooden crate that would serve as the first shelf until something more permanent was built. Nora stood in the doorway, looking at all of it, and said nothing for a while. Then she asked Wayne how the stove had been repaired, because she had been told the firebox was cracked. Wayne said Dell had lined it with fireclay from the smith, which had taken 4 attempts to get right, but had held the last test fire without any smoke coming through. Nora looked at Dell's back on the roof and said, somewhat carefully, that she had not known he worked with clay. Wayne said Dell worked with whatever a thing needed. She left without offering a direct opinion. What she did 3 days later was send a wagon load of split firewood to be stacked against the east wall of the schoolhouse, which was as close to an acknowledgement as Nora Fitch's nature allowed. September came, and the school opened. 26 children arrived on the first morning. Wayne had expected perhaps 18, given that some families were still out at harvest, and others had needed convincing. 26 was not 18. He looked at them standing in the yard in the early light, ranging in age from 6 to 15, in various states of clothing from the neat to the held together, and he felt the particular steadiness that comes when a person has done hard preparatory work, and the thing they prepared for is now standing in front of them. Ruth was the first one through the door. She had been at the schoolhouse before anyone else, having come from the boarding house at first light to restack the book crate and sweep the floor, and she was already seated at the front bench when the other children arrived. She looked at Wayne from that bench with an expression that said she considered herself a part of what had been built, which was correct. The school ran well through September. Wayne taught reading and arithmetic in the mornings and geography and natural history in the afternoons, and on Fridays he read aloud from the history volumes while the older students copied passages onto their slates. He had no trouble keeping order, which surprised some of the parents who had expected a young teacher to struggle. He did not struggle because he had been taught by a father who believed that children did not need to be frightened into learning, only given something worth paying attention to. And Wayne had taken that lesson to heart. The hard night came in early October. The first frost had been creeping southward all week. The temperature had dropped sharply each night, and Wayne had been watching the gap along the north ridge where one board had not seated perfectly, and a thin line of sky was still visible when the light came through at the right angle. Dell had looked at it twice and said it needed another course of oakum packing to seal it properly, but the weather had been holding and he had gone to finish a cabinet job he owed, promising to be back before the end of the week. The end of the week arrived with a north wind. Wayne woke at midnight to the sound of it pressing against the roof, and he lay in his bed at the boarding house for 10 minutes, listening to it drop in pitch and rise again and drop, and then he dressed and walked to the schoolhouse. The temperature outside was somewhere around 30 degrees. Not the killing cold that came later in the season, but the cold that found gaps, and the thin line along the north ridge was a gap. He could see it by lantern from inside. The faintest whisper of outside air moving through. Not yet a draft that would put out a flame, but enough to tell him that if the temperature dropped another 10 degrees by morning, which the sky suggested it would, the stove would not hold the room by 7 o'clock when the children arrived. He was not a carpenter. He knew that. He also knew that Dell had shown him twice the process for packing oakum into a roof joint, and that there was a roll of oakum and a packing tool in the shed at the back of the schoolhouse. He also knew that working on a pitched roof alone in the dark at 30 degrees was not a thing he should do without another person present. He walked to Dell's house and knocked. Dell opened the door in about 30 seconds, which told Wayne he had not been entirely asleep either. Wayne explained the gap and the wind. Dell looked at the sky for a moment, agreed with the diagnosis, and went to get his coat. They worked from 11 in the evening until nearly 5 in the morning. Dell on the roof and Wayne below, handing up materials, holding the ladder steady, keeping the lantern positioned so Dell could see the joint. The wind did not let up. It came from the north at a steady press, not gusting wildly but leaning on everything it touched with a patient and considerable weight, and the temperature fell to 22 degrees by the count of Wayne's pocket thermometer at 2 in the morning, and to somewhere below that by 3. Dell's hands were wrapped in cloth by midnight. He worked methodically, which was how he did everything, without complaint and without hurrying, packing the oakum into the joint in careful passes and then running a bead of pine tar over it to lock it down. There was a second gap, smaller, 2 feet west of the first, that they had not known about until the lantern angle revealed it from below. And Dell dealt with that one too, by feel as much as by sight, his fingers by then not fully responsive to what he was asking of them. Wayne kept the stove burning through the night to warm the room and test the seal as it set. He fed it every hour with the firewood Nora had sent, and each time he added wood, he held his hand near the flue collar to feel whether the draw was clean, and by 4 in the morning the draw was clean and steady, and the gap along the north ridge was cold to the touch from the outside and warm from the inside, which was the right order. At 5 o'clock, Dell came down from the roof, and Wayne handed him a tin cup of water that had been sitting near the stove and was as close to warm as it was going to get without a second pot. Dell drank it and looked at the roof from the floor and said that it would hold. He said it the way a man states a fact he has verified, rather than a thing he hopes for. Wayne said he thought so too. They sat on 2 of the cottonwood benches in the firelit room, while the sky outside the south window went from black to a deep and transparent gray, and the stove gave off the flat red warmth of a fire that has been fed steadily through a long night and has settled into itself. Neither of them said much. There was not much that needed saying. A night's work done together does its own talking. Ruth arrived at 5:30. She came the way she always came in those early morning hours, without announcement, carrying the water pail. And she stopped in the doorway and looked at the 2 of them on the benches and looked at the stove and looked up at the roof where the first pale light was coming through the south window and not coming through anywhere else. She set the pail down. She said, "It's sealed." She said it to no one in particular, or perhaps to both of them, or perhaps to the room itself. Her voice was level and certain, the voice of a 12-year-old who has been paying close enough attention to know what a good result looks like, and the 3 words carried the weight of everything that had been hauled and measured and cut and fitted since July. Dell nodded once. Wayne said that it was. The children arrived that morning and found the stove burning and the room warm and the books in the crate and the slates in a stack on the front bench, and their teacher standing at the repaired chalkboard with a new piece of chalk in his hand. And none of them knew about the night that had preceded the morning they walked into, which was exactly as it should be. There are moments when a thing that was doubted simply stops being doubted, not because anyone announces the change, but because the evidence is standing in front of the people who doubted, and they can see it clearly. The Caldwell School was one of those moments. The shift happened quietly, the way most honest things do, and the town did not need to make a ceremony of it. Caleb Foss never collected on his wager with the barber. He did not, to his credit, try to renegotiate the terms. He said in the feed store one afternoon in late October that the new teacher had turned out to be a harder worker than he had calculated, and he left it at that. The barber agreed. Nora Fitch came to the schoolhouse on the 3rd Friday of October during the afternoon reading hour. She stood outside the window for a time, listening to Wayne's voice through the glass, and when the session ended and the children came out, she went inside and looked at the books in the crate and the slates on the walls and the stove, and she told Wayne that the territorial board had received his first monthly report and had approved a small supplemental appropriation for additional materials. She also told him, in the same businesslike tone, that she had asked the land officer to expedite the title resolution on the abandoned grain shed so that if the school needed additional lumber in the spring, it would be available without having to go to Foss for it. Wayne thanked her. She said she wished the roof had been in better shape when he arrived, in a tone that, for Nora Fitch, was quite close to an apology. Then she left. Del Marsh came to the school on the last Friday of October to look at the bench that had developed a loose peg on the left end. He repaired it in about 10 minutes, and while he was there, Ruth showed him the natural history book with the color plates. Turning to the section on migratory birds that she had been reading to the younger students, Del looked at the plates for a moment with his careful hands flat on the bench beside the book, and then said, somewhat gruffly, that it was a good book. Ruth said yes, it was. She said she was going to be a teacher when she was grown, in the matter-of-fact way that 12-year-olds announce certainties. And Del looked at her for a moment and then at Wayne, and said nothing. But the look on his face was the closest thing to uncomplicated happiness that either of them had seen on him all summer. The traveling book box arrived in October as the territorial librarian had promised. 40 volumes, fiction and history, and natural science and practical arithmetic, and Wayne arranged them on the puncheon floor in a long row and let the students come to school on a Saturday morning to walk along them and choose the ones they wanted to read first. 22 of the 26 enrolled students came that Saturday. The other 4 sent word that they would come on Monday. He sent a receipt back to the territorial librarian with a handwritten note of thanks and a list of what the students had chosen first, because he thought the librarian should know that the books were being read. The winter came, and the school held. The stove proved adequate to the room's new sealed walls, and the firewood that Nora had sent was supplemented by a donation from 3 farming families who came around to the view that a heated schoolroom was in their practical interest. Wayne taught through November and December and into the new year without the kind of crisis that some had predicted would come for a young teacher alone in a frontier posting. Because the young teacher had done his preparation in July, and the preparation was what carried the winter. Wayne Jennings taught in Caldwell for 31 years. He never left for a better posting, though he was offered one 3 times, because by the time the offers came, there were students in the town who were the children of his first students, and the continuity of that seemed to him worth more than a larger salary in a more comfortable place. Del Marsh built 3 more schoolhouses in the county over the years that followed, each one better than the last, and his reputation as a carpenter recovered from the fence dispute and the other things the town had decided about him, not through any public rehabilitation, but through the accumulated evidence of solid work done well, which is the most durable kind of argument. He and Wayne remained on easy terms for the rest of Del's life. They did not speak often or at length, but when they passed each other in town, they exchanged the particular nod of 2 men who have spent a cold night working on a roof together and know what that is worth. Nora Fitch and Wayne arrived at a kind of mutual regard over the years that neither of them would have called warm exactly, but that was reliable and honest and served the town well. She consulted him on educational matters. He consulted her on practical ones. When the county built a new schoolhouse in 1891 on the site of the old one, larger and with proper wainscoting and a window on each wall, Nora made sure the puncheon floor from the first building was salvaged and used in the attached entryway, which she said was a matter of not wasting sound lumber, and which everyone understood meant something more than that. Ruth Denby taught school in a neighboring county for 28 years, starting in 1893 when she was 22. And the students who came through her schoolroom over those decades learned to read and reckon from the same patient and particular method she had first watched, applied in that roofless frame in the summer of 1883, when she had carried water pails in the heat and counted nails in a tin box, and decided with the precise authority of a 12-year-old who has been paying close attention that the enterprise was worth believing in. She kept the natural history book with the color plates. It had been donated to the school and was technically the property of the county, but when the 1891 building opened and the new set of readers arrived, no one made a claim on it, and Ruth took it home and kept it on the shelf above her own chalkboard for the rest of her career. Wayne's handwriting was still faintly legible on the original slate, the cracked one that had been leaning against the wall when he arrived, the one with the word arithmetic chalked on its good half by whoever had tried before him. He had used it through the first 2 years of school, erasing and rewriting, until the crack widened enough that it was no longer safe to prop upright. And then he had set it in the corner behind the stove, and there it stayed. When the school moved to the new building, it stayed in the old one. When the old building came down to make way for the new, it was Ruth who carried it out, wrapped in a piece of canvas, and it ended up in her classroom along with the natural history book. And it was there when she retired, and it was there when her students, now grown and with children of their own, came to help her pack the room. What she had written on her side of it, sometime in the first year she was teaching, in careful chalk letters across the good half that her teacher had once used, was a single word: arithmetic. If you have a story of someone who did what everyone said couldn't be done, leave it in the comments below. Those are the stories worth keeping. And if this one stayed with you, there are more like it here. Ordinary people in a hard country doing the quiet work that held things together.